The Gilded Cage. The morning light came through the tall windows of the Morrow penthouse in long, pale strips, falling across marble floors and expensive furniture that nobody actually sat on. Clara stood at the kitchen counter in a soft grey robe, her dark hair loosely pinned, pouring coffee into 2 white cups out of habit, out of 5 years of habit, before she remembered. Ethan hadn't come home last night. She set the second cup aside and wrapped both hands around her own, looking out at the city below. 41 floors up, everything looked small and manageable. She had learned to appreciate that view on difficult mornings. Ethan Morrow was the kind of man people described before they described the room he had entered. Sharp jaw, easy confidence, the particular kind of smile that made investors open their checkbooks without quite understanding why. He had built Morrow Solar Technologies from a shared office and a borrowed laptop into one of the most talked-about clean energy startups in the country. Magazines called him visionary. His board called him relentless. His assistant called him difficult, but only in private. Clara had called him hers. She had met him at a gallery opening 7 years ago, before the covers and the conferences, when he was brilliant but still rough at the edges, and she was simply a woman who appreciated quiet things, old wine, foreign films, rain on window glass. She had loved him in the way that asks nothing back, steadily and without performance. But somewhere between the first funding round and the fourth, Ethan had started looking at Clara the way people look at childhood furniture, fondly, distantly, as something that no longer quite fit. "You never come to the events," he had said once, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "People ask about you and I don't know what to say." "Say I was reading," she had offered, and he had looked at her as though she had confirmed something he suspected. What Clara never told him, what she had never told anyone in this life, was that before she was Clara Weston Morrow, she had been the sole heir to Weston Capital, a quietly enormous international investment group built over 50 years by her grandmother Renata Weston, a woman so strategically private that financial journalists had written entire profiles of her fortune without ever printing a photograph. Renata had sat Clara down at 17 and said, in the particular tone she reserved for important things, "People will love your money before they love you, little one. Let them love you first." So Clara had lived simply, worked as a literary translator, dressed without labels, and when Ethan Morrow had looked at her across a gallery room with something unguarded in his eyes, she had believed, she had genuinely believed, that she had found the love Renata was protecting her for. She had been wrong. Or perhaps not wrong, exactly. Perhaps she had been right about who Ethan once was, and simply hadn't known how quickly wealth could reshape a person from the inside, the way water reshapes stone, slowly, and then completely. She first heard Vivian Chase's name from Ethan's phone, which had buzzed 3 times during dinner with a name he tilted away from her. She saw Vivian's public profile that same night, glossy and loud and curated to a blinding shine, all champagne brunches and brand partnerships and captions that used the word iconic without irony. Clara didn't cry. She finished the chapter she was translating, made herself chamomile tea, and sat for a long time in the dark living room thinking about her grandmother, about patience, about what love actually owed a person. Then she opened her laptop, not to cry, not to search for proof, but to make a phone call to Daniel Voss, her most trusted advisor, who answered on the second ring as he always did. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I need you to start watching something for me." And so it began, not with tears, not with confrontation, but with the particular kind of stillness that comes before everything changes. The paper crown. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara thought was appropriate. Tuesdays were neither dramatic nor gentle, they simply were, which matched exactly the way Ethan had ended 5 years of marriage. No conversation, no hotel room argument, no final honest moment over dinner. Just Marcus Hale, Ethan's silver-haired lawyer, appearing at the penthouse door with a manila envelope and an expression trained to reveal nothing. "Mr. Morrow asked me to deliver these personally," Marcus said, which was a polite way of saying Ethan couldn't face her. Clara took the envelope with steady hands, offered Marcus coffee, which he declined, and closed the door quietly behind him. She stood in the hallway for a moment, the envelope held loosely at her side, and noticed that she felt something, but it wasn't devastation. It was closer to the feeling of finishing a long book whose ending you had already guessed but hoped might surprise you. She signed every page that same afternoon, without a single amendment, without asking for the penthouse or the joint accounts or the weekend house in the hills that she had actually loved. She kept only what was hers before the marriage and asked for nothing that had accumulated between them. When Marcus called 2 days later, barely concealing his confusion, and asked if she had reviewed everything with her own legal counsel, Clara said simply, "I understand everything perfectly, Marcus. Please tell Ethan the papers are ready." The silence on the line told her Marcus had expected, as Ethan had certainly expected, tears, demands, a counteroffer. Some evidence that she had needed him. She hadn't told him there was nothing to fight over. Not because she had nothing, but because what she had made the penthouse look like a starter apartment. 3 weeks after the papers were filed, Ethan appeared on the front page of a lifestyle magazine standing on that same rooftop where he had hosted press events, his arm around Vivian Chase, who wore a diamond the size of a small ambition. The headline read, "Morrow moves on, Solar CEO announces surprise engagement." Clara saw it at a cafe near her translator's studio. She looked at it for exactly 4 seconds, finished her espresso, and took out her phone. "Daniel," she said when he answered, "I'm ready to move forward." Daniel Voss was 53, had worked for Western Capital since Clara was in school, and was one of perhaps 8 people in the world who knew the full picture of what Clara Weston actually owned. He was methodical, discreet, and deeply loyal in the way that only people who had watched someone grow up could be. "I've been waiting for that call," he said. "How far do you want to go?" "Far enough that the truth speaks for itself," Clara said. "Not a single step further." That distinction mattered to her. She was not interested in destruction. She had no appetite for watching Ethan publicly humiliated or financially ruined. What she wanted was something quieter and more precise. She wanted the truth, which she had withheld for love, to finally stand in the light. In a glass-walled conference room that afternoon, Clara sat across from Daniel and 3 of Western Capital's senior analysts and did something she had not done in 5 years of marriage. She became, fully and without apology, the person she actually was. She pulled up the Consolidated Holdings report on the screen and studied it with the calm, practiced eye Renata had spent years developing in her. Western Capital's portfolio was vast, diversified, and meticulously quiet. Infrastructure bonds across 4 continents, private equity stakes in European hospitality chains, media holdings, and, here she paused, a small but growing position in clean energy technology companies, accumulated over the past 2 years by the Capital Group's automated acquisition strategy. Among those positions, a 9.4% stake in Morrow Solar Technologies, purchased in fragments through holding companies over 18 months. Ethan had no idea. She tapped the screen. "Daniel, what would it take to reach majority control?" Daniel slid a single page across the table. Clara read it, turned it face down, and looked out the window at the city she had moved through quietly for years. "And the Soleil Grand Hotel?" she asked. Vivian announced the wedding venue last week on her platform. "It went to private sale last quarter," Daniel said. "The acquisition group is still undisclosed. The transfer could be made clean and entirely above board within 30 days. Clara nodded slowly. Outside, the city hummed along, indifferent and enormous, knowing nothing of what was being decided in this quiet room by a woman the world had badly underestimated. "Do it," she said. "All of it. But carefully, Daniel. Legally, ethically, completely above board. I want no part of this to look like revenge." "What do you want it to look like?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The truth," she said. "I want it to look exactly like the truth." She rode home that evening in the back of an unmarked car, watching the city light streak past the window, and thought about Renata, about the particular kind of power her grandmother had built not through aggression but through patience, clarity, and the quiet refusal to be anyone other than exactly who she was. "The world respects a loud voice," Renata had once told her, "but it remembers a calm one." Clara leaned her head against the cool glass and, for the first time in a very long while, felt something that resembled peace. Threads of silk and steel. Spring arrived in the city like a slow exhale, and with it came the particular kind of busy silence that surrounds a woman who is building something. Clara had moved into a smaller apartment in the old quarter of the city, exposed brick, tall shelves crowded with books, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and whatever she was translating that week. From the outside it looked like the home of someone modest and content, which was precisely the point, and also, in ways that had nothing to do with strategy, genuinely true. She worked mornings at her desk by the window, finishing a translation commission she had promised a Milan-based publisher. She worked afternoons with Daniel and his team, piece by careful piece assembling something that would, in a matter of weeks, rewrite the architecture of Ethan Morrow's world without making a single sound before it was ready. It was during one of those afternoon sessions, a grey Wednesday with rain tapping at the conference room windows, that Daniel placed a new report in front of her. Morrow Solar's Q2 projections came in below expectation, he said. Their primary hardware supplier backed out of the contract. Ethan has been quietly shopping for emergency investors for 6 weeks. Clara read the report carefully. How is he handling it publicly? Vivian's platform, Daniel said with professional neutrality. She posted a reel of the two of them at a sustainability summit last week. Engagement was strong. Nobody outside the board knows yet. Clara set the report down. She understood what Ethan was doing, papering over the structural cracks in his company with the aesthetic shine of his new relationship, the way someone might hang expensive art over a damp wall. It would work, for a while. It always did. What's our current position? She asked. As of this morning, Western Capital's holding companies own 34.7% of Morrow Solar, distributed across 6 separate entities. None of them traceable to you without a court order. And for majority control, another 16%. Available, but it will require moving carefully over 3 to 4 weeks to avoid triggering disclosure thresholds. Then we move carefully, Clara said. But she sat with the number, 34.7%, for a long moment after the meeting. She was already, quietly, the single largest stakeholder in a company her husband had built and never once thought to tell her about in any real way. He had come home from board meetings flushed with energy and talked at her about valuations and runway and disruption, and she had listened, asked good questions, made him dinner, and never once mentioned that she understood every word with the depth of someone who had grown up reading balance sheets the way other children read fairy tales. That particular memory sat in her chest with a dull weight. She walked home that evening instead of taking the car. The rain had softened to a mist and the old quarter streets gleamed under the lamplight. She stopped at her usual corner shop for bread and a small bunch of white tulips, nodded at the owner who knew her only as the quiet woman in the third-floor apartment who tipped generously and left good book recommendations on the counter. Nobody in this street knew what she carried. She thought about Ethan as she walked, which she still allowed herself to do, not with bitterness, but with the kind of sad clarity that comes after grief has burned through and left something more honest behind. She thought about the early years, the small apartment they had first shared before the money arrived, the way he used to read aloud to her from whatever he was working on, needing her reaction before anyone else's. She thought about the night his first major funding came through and he had lifted her off the floor in the kitchen, laughing, his face pressed into her hair. She had loved that version of him with her whole self. The man on that magazine cover with Vivian's diamond catching the light, that man she did not know. Or perhaps she knew him too well. He was what happened when ambition met praise and found nothing sturdy enough inside to stay the same. Back in her apartment she placed the tulips in a glass vase, made herself dinner, and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a glass of red wine at her elbow. She pulled up a quiet corner of the internet where, months ago, she had begun reading about the Soleil Grand Hotel. The Soleil Grand was the kind of place that existed to make occasions feel permanent. 22 floors of Edwardian grandeur in the heart of the city, a grand ballroom with a ceiling that had been painted by 3 different artists across 100 years, a reputation for hosting the kind of events people described for decades afterward. Vivian had announced it on her platform with predictable theatrics, a reel of herself walking through the gold-lit lobby, pointing at chandeliers, captions full of superlatives. Dream venue, dream man, dream life. The acquisition had completed quietly 2 weeks prior. Clara was now the legal majority owner of the Soleil Grand Hotel. She took a slow sip of wine and allowed herself, just once, a very small smile. Not because of what it meant for the wedding, but because Renata had always said that the most powerful position in any room was the one nobody thought to look for, the quiet person in the corner who actually owned the building. The week before the wedding, Daniel called with the final confirmation. Western Capital's distributed holding companies had crossed the threshold. They now controlled 51.3% of Morrow Solar Technologies. Ethan Morrow's company belonged, silently and legally, to his ex-wife. Clara sat with that fact for a long time, alone in her brick-walled apartment, the white tulips on the table between her and the window, the city outside doing what cities do, moving, indifferent, magnificent. Then she called Billionaire, the sharp and deeply principled legal counsel who had advised Western Capital for a decade, and said, "Priya, I need you at the Soleil Grand on Saturday. Bring the full documentation. We're going to do this once, cleanly, and then it will be done." "Understood," said Priya. "And Clara, are you sure?" Clara looked at the tulips, their clean white heads tilted slightly toward the light. "I have never been more sure of anything," she said quietly. "The ceremony. The ceremony." The Soleil Grand on a Saturday in late May looked exactly as Vivian Chase had promised her followers it would, impossible and golden, every surface catching the afternoon light and returning it transformed into something warmer, something that made even the most unsentimental guests pause in the doorway and feel briefly moved. 300 people had come from the particular stratum of society that attends weddings as a form of professional networking dressed in formal clothing. There were investors and magazine editors and a minor politician and 4 people who appeared on television and believed that made them interesting. There was Marcus Hale, Ethan's lawyer, in a grey suit, watching the room the way lawyers watch rooms. There was Vivian's manager, who had been coordinating the livestream setup with the focused intensity of someone covering a state event. And there was Ethan. He stood at the front of the grand ballroom beside the officiant, and he looked, Clara had been told later, by someone who had watched him carefully, like a man who had arranged everything exactly as he intended and found, standing in the middle of it, that it felt less like joy and more like a room he wasn't sure he had meant to enter. He looked good. He always looked good. Black suit, no tie, the particular studied effortlessly of a man whose image consultant had spent 3 hours achieving it. But his jaw was set in a way that Clara would have recognized, the way it always set when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. Vivian arrived to orchestral music and considerable applause, which she absorbed with the ease of someone who had been practicing absorption of applause since her early 20s. Her gown was architectural and extraordinary and designed to be photographed, which it was, from 12 separate angles simultaneously. The live stream was already running, 200,000 viewers according to the counter in the corner of her team's monitor, the number climbing steadily. The officiant raised his voice above the soft rustle of the room settling into ceremony. Ethan turned to face Vivian. She smiled at him with her public smile, dazzling, practiced, complete. And then the door opened. It was not dramatic in the way of films, no sudden wind, no gasp from a single observant guest near the back. It was instead the quiet and precise entrance of Billionaire, in a charcoal blazer, accompanied by 2 associates carrying document folders, walking with the measured pace of someone who understood that interrupting a wedding ceremony was a significant act and intended to conduct it with appropriate gravity. She spoke first to the event coordinator near the door, briefly, in a low voice. The coordinator's expression changed. He moved toward the officiant. The officiant paused mid-sentence. The room felt the pause, that specific texture of interrupted ceremony, and 300 people turned, in the gentle herd movement of collective attention, toward the door. Then Clara walked in. She had not tried to be striking. She had not tried to be anything other than herself, which had always been, when she allowed it fully, more than enough. Ivory blazer over a simple silk top, dark trousers, her hair down and slightly loose, no extraordinary jewelry except her grandmother Renata's slim gold watch on her left wrist. She walked at the pace of someone who owned the building, which she did, and the room understood something before it understood what it was understanding. Ethan saw her. His expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, confusion, something that in another man might have been hope, and then the careful professional blankness of someone who has learned to manage his face in public. Vivian's eyes narrowed by a fraction. The live stream counter hit 240,000. Clara reached the small platform near the front where the wedding's own microphone stood, the one Vivian's team had set up for the ceremony's musical moments. She stepped up to it without hurry, and in the complete silence that had fallen over the ballroom the way snow falls, suddenly and from everywhere, she spoke. Her voice was clear, unhurried, warm, even, in the way of someone who has nothing left to prove. "I apologize for the interruption," she began, which produced a sound from somewhere in the crowd, a soft, collective exhale that wasn't quite laughter. "My name is Clara Weston. Some of you know me as Ethan's ex-wife. I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce myself more completely." Priya stepped forward and nodded at her. The associates opened the document folders. "My grandmother, Renata Weston, founded Western Capital in 1971. At the time of her passing, she left it entirely to me. For reasons I will not take time to explain here, I chose not to disclose this during my marriage. She looked at Ethan then, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the particular clarity of someone choosing honesty as a final act of respect. Ethan, I loved you enough to want to be loved as simply Clara. I'm sorry if that was a kind of withholding. I have thought about that. A sound from somewhere in the crowd, Marcus Hale setting down his champagne glass. As of 12 days ago, Clara continued, her voice unchanged, Western Capital's holding entities own a controlling 51.3% of Morrow Solar Technologies. She paused, not for effect but to allow the information to actually land. Priya, if you would. Priya placed the primary documentation on the display table that had been set up, quietly, legally, irrefutably. Additionally, the Soleil Grand Hotel was acquired by Western Capital's hospitality division 6 weeks ago. I am the legal majority owner of the property in which we are currently standing. Another pause. The hotel staff have been wonderful. Please tip them generously. Somebody laughed, one true laugh, from somewhere near the middle of the room, which broke the surface tension briefly. Vivian had stopped live streaming. Her manager had made a quiet executive decision approximately 90 seconds into Clara's speech. The phone was down. The counter was frozen at 267,000. The board of Morrow Solar will be meeting next week to review the company's leadership structure, Clara said. There is a morality clause in the founding executive contract, standard in reputational agreements of this kind, which is now under review. That is a matter for the board, and I will not preempt their decision here. She looked at the room, 300 people who had come expecting a performance and received instead something they would describe for years and never quite find the right words for. Her eyes moved to Ethan one final time. He was very still. His hands were at his sides. He looked, for the first time in years, like the man she had met at a gallery on a rainy night, stripped of the performance, uncertain, present. I never needed your empire, Ethan, she said, and her voice was soft now, almost only for him. I only wanted your honesty. She stepped back from the microphone, walked across the marble floor, pushed open the tall side door of the Soleil Grand's ballroom, and stepped out into the May afternoon, where the city was doing what it always did, continuing, indifferent and extraordinary, in all directions at once. What he lost. The side exit of the Soleil Grand opened onto a long stone terrace that faced the old quarter of the city. In the late afternoon of a May Saturday, the light came in at an angle that made everything look deliberately composed. The limestone buildings, the window boxes full of early summer flowers, the far sound of the river 2 streets over, the sky beginning its slow lean toward gold. Clara stood at the stone railing and breathed. She had not allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had just done until this moment, when the ballroom was behind her and the door had swung shut on all of it. The silence, the stunned faces, the particular suspended quality of 300 people processing something they hadn't prepared for. Out here there was only the city and the light and the slow unwinding of something she had been carrying for a long time. She placed her hands on the railing and looked out over the rooftops and let herself, finally, feel it all, the love that had been real, the loss that was also real, the years of careful silence and patient watching, and underneath all of it, like a note held so long it becomes something other than sound, the grief of having been beside someone who simply stopped seeing her. She heard the terrace door open behind her. She knew his footsteps. Clara. Ethan's voice was different from the voice he used in rooms full of people. It was lower and rough at the edges, the way it used to be when he came home late and tired and sat on the kitchen counter while she made tea and they talked about nothing important in a way that had always felt, to her, like the most important thing. She didn't turn immediately. She gave them both another moment with the view. Then she turned. He had lost the public version of his face entirely. What remained was something she recognized from years ago and had spent the last 18 months grieving the loss of, something unguarded and earnest and slightly undone. His jacket was gone. His collar was open. He looked as though he had walked out of his own wedding the way a person walks out of a building that is slowly becoming too small to breathe in. You bought my company, he said. It was not an accusation. It was the voice of a man touching something to understand whether it was real. I did, she said. And this building. And this building. He was quiet for a moment. The city moved below them. Somewhere in the street a child was laughing, that particular uncontrolled laughter that belongs only to children and which sounds, at a distance, like water. "The amount you paid for the controlling stake alone," he started. "Ethan," she said gently. He stopped. "I'm not here to discuss numbers." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had stopped doing somewhere between the second year and the third, when the company started consuming his attention and she had quietly learned to fill the space he left with books and translations and the particular companionship of her own mind. "You never told me," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't accusation. It was closer to wonder, and underneath that, something that hurt. "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved, standing in the evening light with the last 5 years between them and nothing left to manage or protect. "Because I wanted to be loved before I was understood," she said. "And because my grandmother told me, very early, that money changes the way people see you before they mean it to. And I just wanted to be Clara. Just that. Not an inheritance, not a portfolio, not a strategy. Just a woman you came home to." Something moved across Ethan's face, not one thing but several, in rapid, unguarded sequence, the way a sky changes in autumn. "I did love you," he said. It came out low and careful, like something he was handling because it was fragile. "I did, Clara. I just lost the thread of it," she said quietly. "Yes." The word landed between them, small and honest and far too late. She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing close enough that she could see the detail of him, the slight disarray of his hair, the way his hands were not quite steady at his sides, the particular expression of a man who has, in the space of 20 minutes, watched his entire constructed self dissolve and found, beneath it, something he had not expected to find. Regret that was actually about her, specifically, and not about what she owned. That was the thing that made her eyes sting. Not the betrayal, not the divorce, not the magazine cover. This, him standing here with no performance left, loving her belatedly and badly and too late. He reached out and touched her hand where it rested on the railing. Just his fingers over hers, carefully, the way you touch something you've broken and cannot fix but cannot stop yourself from reaching toward. "I keep thinking about the apartment," he said. "The first one. The one with the window that didn't close all the way and the kitchen that was too small and you used to put flowers in that blue jar on the sill." "White tulips," she said. Her voice was steady. "Just barely. You still buy them. Every week." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them there was something in them that was, she thought, the most honest thing she had seen on his face in years. "I'm not going to ask you to come back," he said. "I don't have the right to ask you anything. I know that. I needed to stand here and say that losing you was the thing I did, and I want you to know that I know it was the thing I did. Not the company. Not the hotel." His thumb moved once, slowly, over her knuckles. "You." The city made its evening sounds around them. The light was fully golden now, the particular impossible gold of May evenings that always seems to be trying to hold something still that cannot be held. Clara looked at their hands. His over hers. The familiar weight of him, the familiar warmth, all the years of knowing exactly how he occupied space in a room. She turned her hand over slowly and held his, just for a moment, not to offer anything, not to promise anything, but because the heart is not always rational and she had loved him truly and that truth did not simply cease because everything else had. She felt his breath catch. Then she gently, with great care, released his hand. "I know you know it, Ethan," she said. Her voice was soft and full and final. "And I want you to carry that knowing somewhere useful, somewhere it makes you a better person than the one who tilted his phone away from me at dinner." She looked up at him, and her eyes were clear. "I forgive you. Fully. Not for you, for me, because I refuse to carry it." He nodded. His jaw was tight. She could see the effort it was taking him to simply stand here in the truth of what he had lost without reaching for anything to manage the feeling with. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Milan. First. I have a book to deliver to a publisher." A small pause. "Then probably Rome for the summer. I have always wanted more time in Rome." Something that might, in a different life, have become a smile moved across his face. "You always did. You always forgot," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," he said simply. "I always forgot." They stood for a moment longer in the evening light, two people on a terrace in May, in the gentle aftermath of something enormous, the city below them continuous and unhurried, the sky above beginning its first suggestions of violet. Then Clara picked up the small bag she had set against the railing, smoothed the lapel of her ivory blazer with one hand, and turned toward the terrace steps that led down to the street. "Take care of the tulip place on Mercer Lane if you ever pass it," she said, without turning back. "The owner is a lovely woman. She deserves the business." She walked down the steps. At the bottom she paused, and perhaps she felt his eyes on her back, and perhaps the evening was warm in a way that felt, just for one breath, like being held. Then she walked on, into the gold-lit street, into the city that had always been hers, into the particular spacious freedom of a woman who had chosen herself without losing her softness, who had held power without cruelty, who had loved deeply and honestly and finally, at the end of it all, walked away not diminished but more completely herself than she had ever been. Behind her on the terrace, Ethan Morrow stood alone in the last of the evening light and understood, with the full weight of understanding that arrives too late to be useful and stays forever, exactly what he had held and exactly how he had let it fall. Below, on the street, a woman in an ivory blazer turned a corner. And was gone. End.